mankind. Dead kings, men and things I can define. All cages, bars, wagons, butter your mind. In sense of compliments, the color of time. Who cares what games we choose? Little to win, but nothing to lose.
Until now, we've dealt with the way in which psychedelia changed pop music. However, 20th century pop culture was driven not just by music. Cinema was equally important, and cinema too went through an upheaval in those years, an upheaval that was deeply affected by the spirit of psychedelia. This chapter will be dedicated to that revolution. In previous episodes I claimed that one of the characteristics of the pop revolution was that it shifted the focus from writing to performance. Since the beginning of the 20th century, the true heroes of music are the performers, but since the dominant culture was still under the thrall of previous centuries and valued writing over performance, pop was regarded as inferior to classical music, where the composers are the heroes. Only when our consciousness was revolutionized, and started to regard the essence of music as the experience that you feel when you hear it performed, was the road open to understanding the art of pop music. A similar thing happened in cinema. At first, the audience was charmed by the effect of moving picture and by the image of the movie stars, and less by things that the culture guardians considered as valued, such as plot, dialogue, and acting. The system that ruled Hollywood from the 20s to the 60s was built to cater to the audience's taste, so cinema was not considered art by the intellectuals. But outside of Hollywood, some artists were already finding possibilities in the art of movie making. So before we discuss what happened to Hollywood in the 60s, we have to take a detour through European cinema. And we begin our story in the mid-1910s, in a war-torn continent, as artists were trying to give expression to the ailing state of the European spirit, and these expressions could become quite radical. The leading figure of the French avant-garde in those years was the poet and playwright Guillaume Apollinaire, who used his power to advance the careers of upcoming artists, the more radical the better. Among his protégés were three young poets, André Breton, Louis Aragon, and Philippe Soupault, who were looking for a new form to express their rage. In 1917, Apollinaire coined the term surrealism to define the kind of heightened reality that can be achieved by art. It didn't mean that much to him, but the Three Musketeers would soon pick it up and imbue it with more depth. The charismatic Breton was the leader of the group, and the one who articulated its ideology. During the war, as he served in a military hospital, Breton discovered the writings of Sigmund Freud, unknown in France at this point, and became fascinated with the subconscious and how it affects our lives. It explained a lot about the madness around him, and he wanted to find ways to express the contents of the subconscious. He needed to find a method to do so, and the method was provided by something else entirely. In the years after the war, spiritualism was in vogue, and people performed seances to connect to the world of ghosts. Mediums would use automatic writing whatever came into their minds first, and were seen as speaking for the dead. Breton saw it differently. He believed that what was speaking in seances wasn't ghosts, but the subconscious, and he wanted to use this technique for a new kind of art. In 1919, he and Soupault ran sessions of automatic writings, and published the results as a poetry book. In 1920, looking for ways to expand, they went Dada for a while. Dada was born during the war years in Zurich, where a theatre troupe called Cabaret Voltaire mounted an attack on the values of bourgeois society, the values which they believed got us into the madness of the war. Dada was about breaking all the hierarchies which society believes in, and just throwing everything randomly together, in a provocative, funny and iconoclastic way. Breton and his gang were the driving force behind staging Dadaist events in Paris, shocking the theatre-going audience, but they realized that Dada loses a lot of its bite during times of peace. Dada was destructive, and in 1916 it spoke to the sense that a lot of people had that the current culture needs to be destroyed. But now they realize that they need to be more constructive. The enjoyment achieved from the randomness of Dada, they now contended, was because it matches the randomness of our subconscious, and we need to build on that as a way to present an alternative to the bourgeois culture that we are trying to overthrow. And so, the art form known as surrealism was born. The idea of surrealism is that the outside world, which our consciousness perceives, is only part of reality. There is an entire world going on in our subconscious, and to experience reality in its fullness, we must find a way to bring the two worlds together. The problem is, we have access to the subconscious world only in dreams. In other words, precisely at the time when we are not connected to the reality of the outside world. So the challenge is to bring the dream world into our waking hours, experience both worlds at once, and merge them together into one fantastic surreality. In 1922 they went back to automatic writing, but this time they tried to use it to express dreams. They performed seances in which one would go into hypnotic trance, describe his visions, and the others would record his words. The ranks of surrealism started to swell, drawing in most of the Dadaists, as well as new aspiring artists. Pretty soon, Breton was the leader of a pretty large artistic movement. Surrealism, at this point, was about personal and spiritual rebellion against bourgeois life, and was not political. As the hippies would do decades later, Breton believed that the revolution should be carried out in the mind. But, as we recall, surrealism was about bringing together the inner world and the outer world, which eventually led them to want to take the rebellion to the outer world, to the social and political spheres. And in the 20s, when you talked about rebelling against the bourgeois order, the only way to go was the Marxist-Leninist route. In the middle of the decade, Breton discovered the writings of Trotsky, and saw him as the political manifestation of what the surrealists were trying to achieve spiritually. Breton and Aragon allied their movement with the Communist Party, with the same radical zeal that they displayed about their art, which meant that every member of the group that did not fall in line, like the maverick Antonin Artaud, and even founder Philippe Soupault, was banished from its ranks. Louis Aragon went furthest of all. While Breton was determined to remain true to the original spirit of surrealism, Aragon started to interpret their art through the lens of dialectic materialism. When a young member called Salvador Dalí wanted to create a surrealist object that included glasses of milk, Aragon, to the amazement of his friends, chastised him for wasting milk while other people in the world are starving. The surrealists soon found that when the Communist Party speaks of freedom, it doesn't mean the same thing that they do, and that being a good Marxist means giving up on self-expression and art. When the same Dalí published an explicitly pornographic poem in the movement's bulletin, the Communist Party denounced the surrealists for allowing it to be published. By the 1930s, it became obvious that surrealism and Bolshevism cannot mix. Some, like Aragon, left the movement and became fully fledged communists, whereas others, like Breton, were kicked out of the party. By then, however, the kind of poetry that Breton represented lost its dominance. The art of surrealism now became mainly visual, dominated by painters, who were trying to portray the twilight zone between reality and the dream world. And among the surrealist painters, it was Salvador Dalí who held the greatest promise. Dalí, unlike the original surrealists, was not French. He was from Spain, where the Catholic Church was a lot more dominant, which meant that he grew up in a repressive culture that did not allow for the irrational cravings to be manifested, not even in thought. So for him, expressing the subconscious, with all its forbidden sinful thoughts, was always charged with a lot of guilt, and had a lot more explosive power. One of his favorite themes was masturbation, and in several of his early paintings we see depictions of enlarged hands which are distorted in some way, a combination of pleasure and guilt. The striking imagery of Dalí's paintings epitomized the surrealist attempt to bring dreams to life. There was another young artist who made the trip from Madrid to Paris in the late 20s. But unlike his friend Dalí, who found his calling in painting, Luis Buñuel was drawn to that newest of art forms, the cinema. By the 1920s, Hollywood was already taking its audience on lavish flights of fantasy, showing that it can recreate anything one could imagine. But escapist fantasy wasn't what Buñuel was after. He wanted to merge the fantasy with real life, to make surrealism. In 1929 he got together with Dalí, and the two employed surrealist techniques to write a script. Buñuel then turned it into a 21-minute silent film, called Andalusian Dog, or in French, Un Chien Andalou. The movie was like nothing that came before. The imagery, much like in Dalí's paintings, combines religion, guilt about sexual thoughts, death, the rot that comes with death, insects that come with rot, and distorted images, all imagery that was rarely seen in movies. The two most striking scenes come from dreams. Buñuel dreamt that he is cutting open a woman's eye, which makes sense when you consider that he was planning to make a movie that would be an eyesore to his viewers. While Dali, typically, had a dream that seems to involve guilt over masturbation, where he dreamt that ants came out of his hand. When these dreams were visualized on screen, it showed that cinema, of all art forms, was the most suitable to achieve what the surrealists were after. With its ability to portray the fluidity of dreams, and to combine painting and poetry, cinema was the ultimate surrealist experience. And Chien Andalou was enthusiastically received not only by the surrealists and the avant-garde aficionados, but even found commercial success. Buñuel and Dali followed with a movie called L'Âge d'Or, The Golden Age. This is a direct attack on bourgeois values, which, according to Buñuel, are family, patriotism, and religion. By matching up images of bourgeois life against subconscious fantasies, the movie mocks the hypocrisy of the bourgeoisie, who deny to themselves that this subconscious realm exists under the surface of their lofty values. After this movie, Buñuel was invited to Hollywood and went to try his luck in America. But his Marxist leanings closed doors before him, and he had to move to Mexico, where he struggled for decades to gain wider recognition. Dali, on the other hand, became the central figure of surrealism, and a sensation especially in America. He developed a colorful persona, and entertained the public with his weird paintings and provocative public performances. By the end of the 30s, however, his massive commercial success changed him. His paintings now became just mannerisms of his original style, and politically he became a supporter of the fascist Franco regime. He came to symbolize the death of surrealism as a vital artistic genre. One of the things that made surrealism lose its power was that psychoanalysis was no longer an avant-garde thing. The ideas of Freud and his colleagues, who argued that our subconscious is a world of its own that can be explored with scientific means, have always been widely regarded as the kind of fruitcake ideas that can only come up in the minds of Jews. In America, in particular, they were mostly a laughingstock. But after World War II, things were changing. In Hollywood, this change is clearly represented in one movie, which came right at the end of the war, in 1945. Spellbound, by Alfred Hitchcock, takes us into the world of psychoanalysis, but here, the hero psychoanalyst doesn't look like your stereotypical Jewish German mad scientist. She looks like Ingrid Bergman. Bergman plays a young doctor who falls in love with a man, but then realizes that he has amnesia and doesn't remember who he is, except that he has done something terrible. But she, like us, knows that he cannot possibly be a bad man, because he is Gregory Peck. So she takes him to see her old professor, who does live up to the stereotype, and the two are trying to cure him.
Maybe you got something you want to tell me? A single thought? A few words in the corner of your head? Go on, talk to me. Whatever comes into your head, just say what it is.
There's nothing.
Maybe you dreamt something.
Yeah.
What did you dream?
I don't believe in dreams. That Freud stuff's a lot of hooey.
Oh, you are a fine one to talk. You got amnesia and you got a guilt complex. And you don't know if you're coming or going from someplace. But Freud is hooey. This you know. A wise guy.
It's pretty obvious that this scene is directly aimed at those in the audience who still believe that psychoanalysis is mere superstition. You just had two catastrophic world wars. All the claims about the moral progress of man have drowned in horrific bloodshed. You can't really explain why humans decided to commit such atrocities. But Freud is hooey. This you know. Dr. Vulov then explains to his patient, and to the audience, what Freud's theory of dream interpretation is about.
I explained to you about dreams, so you don't think it is hooey. The secrets of who you are and what has made you run away from yourself, all these secrets are buried in your brain. But you don't want to look at them. The human being very often doesn't want to know the truth about himself because he thinks it will make him sick. So he makes himself sicker, trying to forget. You follow this?
Yeah.
Now, Here's where dreams come in. They tell you what you are trying to hide, but they tell it to you all mixed up like pieces of a puzzle that don't fit. The problem of the analyst is to examine this puzzle and put the pieces together in the right place and find out what the devil you are trying to say to yourself.
This is followed by a dream sequence, visualized sumptuously by Salvador Dali, accompanying the description of the dream. Once again we meet the image of an eye being cut open, and other typical surrealist images. It's a great introduction to psychoanalysis, but then, as they analyze the dream, we see a comically simplistic and popularized version of it. They act as if dream interpretation is an exact science, as if every image in the dream has a clear meaning that can be deciphered. This is not how psychoanalysis works, but this is how the general public understood it. In the 50s, Hollywood movies portrayed psychoanalysts as scientists who have a clear understanding of the human psyche. And this gave credence to the kind of reality we've described in Chapter 1, in which many people were hospitalized in mental wards and given treatments that were supposed to fix them and turn them into productive members of society. It's the reality of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. In other words, the very weapon that the surrealists used to attack bourgeois culture with was now used to confirm it. The surrealists used the ideas of psychoanalysis to claim that rationality and science cannot grasp reality in its fullness, because there is the irrational subconscious world. But in the 1950s, people were made to believe that psychoanalysis is a science by which our rationality can fully understand the subconscious world and learn to master it.
Well, does it make any sense to you what I dreamed?
Not yet. You're trying to tell yourself something. What it is, we'll figure out later.
There's a lot more to it.
Go on and try to recall the details. The more cockeyed, the better for the scientific side of it.
It became part of the project of building a perfect society, and the US now regarded itself as the leading light in this project. Hollywood started to take itself more seriously, treating cinema as an art form, and making movies that dealt with the problems facing society. This is the decade that produced the most memorable social dramas, which pitted the different elements in American society against each other and showed how they can eventually achieve harmony. Most of the movies made by Hollywood in those years, in any genre, were movies that had a moral, part of the attempt to make the American public more enlightened. Hollywood, then, started to produce movies that were closer to what the elite regarded as art, but it was still bound by the old Hays Code, which censored scenes of explicit sexuality, violence, nudity, and blasphemy. Meanwhile, European and Japanese cinema, the so-called foreign flicks, were not restricted, and started to draw the youth, who were willing to sit through the foreign language to see some nudity and graphic violence. And there were also some kids who looked at these foreign flicks from a cinema enthusiast perspective, and were learning new things about the art of cinema. In Europe, cinema was already seen as a serious art form. Leading this perspective were French critics and movie makers, who revolutionized the perception of the role of the movie director. In classic Hollywood, directors were part of the team, creating the product that the studio wanted them to make. The French theorists claimed that the director should be an auteur, an artist who controls every aspect of the production. By the late 50s, this led to the rise of the French New Wave. And in Italy, the post-war years saw the rise of neorealism, which wanted to present reality as it is without the Hollywood varnish. With those currents, European movie makers felt that they put their art form on the same level of importance as literature. But if they wanted to be as important as literature, there was a dimension missing. Fine literature isn't just about realism. It often takes deep explorations into the human psyche. And with psychoanalysis now being all the rage, many novels received psychoanalytical interpretations, hailed as uncovering truths about the human mind. European directors took notice, and were looking to go beyond realism. Furthermore, they realized that cinema actually has some advantages when it comes to trying to portray the subconscious, and perhaps could go even further than literature. By the 60s, some movie makers were already talking of cinema as the greatest art form of all, as the purveyor of truth. The hottest name in European cinema in those years was Federico Fellini. Fellini came out of Italian neorealism, but gradually steered it in a more personal and idiosyncratic direction. By the early 60s, he was lauded as the embodiment of the auteur that the French wrote about. In 1963, he released the movie 8½, about a director trying to make a movie. Obviously autobiographical, it shows the director's struggles to create art, and it mixes the real world with things that are going on inside his mind, like doubts, memories, and dreams. Everything is happening on screen all at once, and it's hard to tell where the real world ends and the inner world begins. One of the most influential and pivotal movies of all time, and also a movie that brought surrealism back into cinema. After that, Fellini started to take interest in spiritualism, and also tried LSD. The effects would make their way into his next film, 1965's Giulietta of the Spirits. The first thing that we notice here is a departure from the black and white that characterized all of his movies until now. In the language of cinema, black and white were always seen as purveying gritty realism, whereas color belonged to the land of Oz, the land of Hollywood fantasy. Now, with the return of surrealism, fantasy and reality blended, and the possibilities of shooting in color to make an artistic statement were explored. The movie is about a married bourgeois woman who lives in a haunted house, but the ghosts that haunt her actually come from her subconscious. Full of seances, hallucinations, and dream imagery, it is a fully surrealist movie. Along with Fellini, the other grandmaster of European cinema was the Swedish Ingmar Bergman. Bergman was renowned, since the 50s, for making cinema that explored deep philosophical questions. In 1966 he made the movie Persona, about an actress who suddenly becomes catatonic in the middle of a play, and nothing can snap her out of it. A nurse is assigned to take care of her, and the entire movie is about their relationship, which is slowly revealed to be a dialogue between two sides of the heroine's psyche. The movie contains just a few surreal moments, but it is quite hypnotic, and it took cinema deeper into the subconscious. And with the return of surrealism, Luis Buñuel could finally gain recognition. A forgotten name for 35 years, Buñuel continued to make movies in his adopted homeland Mexico, but without much international success. In the 60s, the world finally came around, and Buñuel found new fame. Belle de Jour, released in 1967, was a hit, and was followed by more hits. Buñuel's films retained the same formula we saw in L'Âge d'Or, using surrealism to mock the hypocrisy of the bourgeoisie and the church, but by now he was also a technically superb director, and distilled the formula to its perfection, with movies that were both artful and popular. When this new surrealism hit swinging London, the mecca of pop in the mid-60s, it gained extra freshness. The two Beatles movies that Dick Lester directed in 64 and 65, Hard Day's Night and Help, were hectic and chaotic, reflecting the life that the Fab Four were living in the heyday of Beatlemania. There was already something surreal in them, especially in Help, which displayed the effects of pot smoking. In 1967, Lester released How I Won the War, a Dadaist anti-war satire starring John Lennon, which contained some surrealist moments. But to get surrealism right, a continental touch was needed. As Help was still in the theaters, a newcomer from Poland called Roman Polanski released Repulsion, a horror movie that geographically takes place in London, but most of it actually takes place in the mind of the heroine, who is slowly going insane.
Sometimes reality is the strangest fantasy of all.
And in 1966, Italian director Michelangelo Antonioni released Blow Up, a movie that brought together the frenzied and hedonistic reality of swinging London with a plot that questioned the reality that we perceive with our senses. The film was a massive hit, shocking Hollywood executives who never imagined that the movie-going public was sophisticated enough for such a chaotic and philosophical movie. A little opening formed in their minds for the possibility of putting money into a different kind of cinema. In 1966, the Hays Code was finally shelved, soon to be replaced by the rating system. This allowed American movie makers to be bolder and make adult-oriented movies, and the new movies didn't fail to arrive. Warren Beatty, one of Hollywood's young stars, wanted to make a European-style movie, and convinced Warner Brothers to finance the film Bonnie and Clyde, which he produced and starred in. Most of the Hollywood establishment regarded the movie as pretty idiotic, but were flabbergasted when it became a big hit and a favorite among young cinema critics, who were tired of old Hollywood and wanted something else. Beyond a fresh approach towards style, pace and editing, the story about two bank robbers who stuck it to the man and became cultural heroes thrilled the young watchers. It became a counterculture favorite. The counterculture youth was more than ready for this new type of cinema. Not only because it was looking for things that were novel and revolutionary, but also because it was turned on and tuned in. Surrealism had many affinities to psychedelia and counterculture values, such as the attempt to go inside the mind to achieve a new perspective on reality, the liberation of sexuality, and the rebellion against bourgeois norms. In the late 60s, rock started to express the hidden desires of the subconscious, and you could find the effects of surrealism in rock song lyrics and album covers. By the early 70s, rockers could be seen in the company of Salvador Dali. For hippies who were looking for cinema that would represent their experience, the aforementioned surrealist European flicks came close. However, there were also essential differences between surrealism and psychedelia. Surrealism is about freeing the subconscious world and merging it with the conscious world to make reality fuller and richer. It recreates the imagery of dreams because it believes that this imagery is the way that our subconscious presents itself to our consciousness. Psychedelia, on the other hand, is about freeing ourselves from the filters of our perception, to see reality as it is. Once we transcend these filters, we also get a better understanding of how our consciousness works. So both surrealism and psychedelia presume to go outside of the boundaries of our conscious mind and get a fuller vision of reality, but in a different way. It was time for someone to make a movie that will capture the psychedelic sensibility. Hollywood actually did try, since the 50s, to make movies aimed at the rock and roll youth, but these youth flicks were badly out of touch. The only place where kids could find something better were the B-movies, the low-budget movies produced by independent movie makers and shown before or after the main feature. The makers of B-movies, free of any artistic pretensions, focused on elements belonging to the cinematic experience, elements such as action, special effects, jump scares, weird visual imagery, and so forth. The king of B-movies was Roger Corman, who was known for needing less than a week to shoot a movie. This rate allowed him to produce numerous flicks since the mid-50s, and his production company served as an internship for many young directors, who learned the craft while dreaming of making new American cinema that will appropriate European influences. Among his interns were future directors like Francis Ford Coppola, Martin Scorsese, Jonathan Demme, Ron Howard, James Cameron, and others. Many actors also began their careers playing in his movies, and in the early 60s his roster included young talents like Jack Nicholson, Peter Fonda, Dennis Hopper, and Bruce Dern. Corman gave the youth exactly what it wanted: horror, science fiction, rock and roll, youth rebellion, sexy bad girls, car chases, all that a movie needs, and without character development, morals, discussion of social problems, and all that nonsense. The speed in which he produced his films allowed him to react quickly to developments in youth culture, so it is no wonder that he was the first to react to the counterculture. When the Hells Angels became notorious, Corman reacted in 1966 with the movie Wild Angels, starring Peter Fonda, who subsequently became the king of biker movies.
Yeah, we don't want nobody telling us what to do. We don't want nobody pushing us around.
I apologize. But tell me, just what is it that you want to do?
Well, we want to be free. We want to be free to do what we want to do. We want to be free to ride. And we want to be free to ride our machines without being hassled by the man. And we want to get loaded.
And in 1967, Corman directed The Trip, a psychedelic movie. Here, too, Fonda stars in the leading role. The script for this movie was written by Jack Nicholson, who in '68 starred in another psychedelic movie, Psych Out. If you ever felt like your life wouldn't be complete until you've seen Jack Nicholson playing Jimi Hendrix on guitar, here you go. So if you were part of the hip youth of the late 60s, and you wanted to watch a movie that related to your experiences, your choices were either American B-movies, which were fun but cinematographically trash, or surrealist European movies, which were deep and beautiful but didn't exactly present the world as you knew it. Someone else was needed, a director who would be an American and in touch with the spirit of the time, but an independent auteur like the European directors. And in the 60s, there was only one man who fit this description, which is why he towered above all else as the most influential director of his time. Stanley Kubrick was there before anyone else. Born in New York in 1928, he displayed a talent for photography at a very early age. In the early 50s he turned to movie making, determined to be independent and succeed outside of the Hollywood system, and he made 2 small films which he financed himself. This was enough to get the attention of an independent producer who agreed to finance him, and gave Stanley the ability to make bigger movies that were astounding in their style and cinematography. In 1957 he made Paths of Glory, a powerful anti-war drama, and in 1960 he agreed, for the first and last time, to work for a big studio, and directed the epic Spartacus. This big and successful project gave him the money and independence he needed, and he moved to England, where he became a completely independent director with control over every little detail in the production. Kubrick did the impossible. He took on the system, on his own, and emerged triumphant. Throughout, he also kept in touch with the spirit of the time. Despite being older than the rock and roll youth, he was able to see the spark in their culture. In 1962 he released Lolita, an adaptation of Vladimir Nabokov's notorious novel about a pedophile novelist who falls in love with a girl and ruins her life. One of the many great things about this novel is that it continuously mocks and subverts our expectations, especially the expectations of those readers who try to psychoanalyze the protagonist and guess his motives. Through his hero Humbert, Nabokov ridicules the pretensions of 1950s culture to understand the human psyche. Kubrick's adaptation, in turn, subverts the novel. Humbert, the European author who comes to America, is still the protagonist, but the movie also spotlights Lolita, the American girl. In Nabokov's book she is mostly Humbert's passive victim, and she is also his ruin, symbolizing how American pop culture became the ruin of European culture. But Kubrick shows that Lolita has a culture of her own, and she is depicted as a much healthier alternative to the decaying European culture represented by Humbert. For the first time, Kubrick displays what would become a staple of his work, his ability to take literary masterpieces and adapt them in a way that completely deconstructs their message. As we discussed in previous chapters, the early 60s saw the rise of the radical left in America, through the folk movement on campus activity. Kubrick was the darling of the movement, with his 2 powerful movies Paths of Glory and Spartacus. But Kubrick was part of the new consciousness, and derided the naivete of these leftists. In 1964 he released Dr. Strangelove, a movie that makes a mockery of both capitalism and Marxism. The movie is an absurd satire of the Cold War, and of the human race that is marching towards its self-destruction due to its blind faith in ridiculous ideals. The story is of an American general who goes insane and sends his bombers to nuke the Soviet Union, unaware that the Russians built a device that will automatically destroy the world in case their country is attacked. We follow the US president as he collaborates with the Kremlin to prevent a nuclear holocaust, but their efforts are thwarted at every turn by the stupidity and pettiness of everyone concerned, who keep thinking through old categories rather than realize that they must cooperate to save themselves from doom. Beyond that, the movie plays mind tricks with the audience. After all the 50s war movies that showed Americans as the heroes saving the world, it's hard for the viewer not to identify with the American bombers, even though you know you should wish for their failure. The subtitle of the movie, How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, may hint that it was Hollywood cinema that made us stop worrying about our destruction as a species. But every Kubrick movie has many layers, and every movie is also a parable about humankind. What we see in this movie is that all the talk about progress, and about getting out of the jungle, is bunk. Humans behave in an animalistic way, and all their enlightened speech is just a charade that they all take part in. We further see that man has transferred too much power to the machines and systems that he built, believing that unlike humans they are devoid of error, forgetting that he is the one building those machines, and he puts his flaws into them. The people who built these instruments did not bring all the possibilities into account, and so, in the deciding moment, these perfect instruments turn against man, and their automatic perfection makes them instruments of doom. Throughout the movie we witness humans trying to use their human faculties, reason, compassion, ingenuity, to overcome the alliance of excessive mechanization and animal nature, but they find that they are overmatched. The movie was met with a furious uproar among conservatives, who saw it as an act of treason. But progressives didn't like it either, because it undermines the belief that is the basis of progressive thought, the belief that man can progress, get out of the jungle and become an enlightened being. But none of this prevented the movie from becoming a hit, especially among youngsters. In the same year that Bob Dylan turned against the left, and accused it of being just as prejudiced as the right, Kubrick's movie chimed the same note, and spoke to the sensibilities of the youth. Carried on the wings of success, Kubrick then turned to an even more ambitious project, and contacted the celebrated science fiction author Arthur C. Clarke, aiming to make a movie that will be about no less than man's place in the universe. They agreed to develop the story together, with Clarke writing it as a novel and Kubrick making a film, and in 1968 both the book and the movie came out, both sharing the title 2001: A Space Odyssey. Both works combine the worldviews of both artists, but the differences between them are even more illuminating, and tell us a lot about Kubrick's cinema. Clarke believed in progress, and his novel tells a clear story. 3 million years ago, when humans were a primitive ape-like species, an advanced race of aliens landed on Earth, a race that wanted to help other races evolve. They programmed humankind to learn how to use tools, and this ability, over the years, made man create better tools and become the master of the world. At the same time, the tools changed him. Since he transferred his powers to his instruments, he became gentler, until he evolved into the Homo sapiens of today. But now we have come to an age where he transferred too much power to his instruments, and they threaten his existence. In the future year 2001, Clarke describes a world at the brink of a nuclear war. Meanwhile, an American expedition to the moon finds a monolith buried under its surface, and once they dig it up it sends a single transmission towards Saturn. This monolith was left there by the aliens, meant to inform them when humankind progressed to the point where it reaches the moon. The American authorities decide to keep the discovery a secret to prevent panic, and send a mission to Saturn to explore. Even the astronauts are unaware of the mission's true purpose, and the only one who knows it is the artificial intelligence running the spaceship, which is infallible and therefore can be trusted. But the planners didn't bring one thing into account. HAL, the artificial intelligence, was programmed to always give truthful information, and this contradicts the order to hide the true aim of the mission from the astronauts. This contradiction makes him erratic, and the astronauts decide that they must shut him down. But HAL, who was programmed to perceive the mission as above all else, decides that he must protect himself to protect the mission, and starts murdering the crew members. Only one member survives, and after he terminates HAL, he carries the mission on his own. He finally gets to Saturn, and the portal opens in space and pulls him in. He goes through a wormhole in space, full of wondrous sights and sounds, until he finds himself in what looks like a hotel room. Clarke explains that the monolith picked information from Earth's TVs, and based on that information the room was designed to make the human feel at home. The alien's original intention was to bring the human over so they can study him, but in the millions of years that have passed, they too have evolved, so they changed the function of the room. It is now a cocoon, in which the astronaut goes through a transformation, and is reborn as a higher being, a sort of a god. In his new form, he returns to Earth just as the two blocks fire nuclear missiles at each other, destroys the missiles, and saves humanity. Progress wins. Kubrick's film tells a similar story, and yet different. It is divided into 3 parts, and the first part is divided in 2, with the first half showing man when he was still an ape, and the second showing him in the space age. In both halves, we see humans in their daily activities, eating, sleeping, communicating, fighting, and we see that essentially, man is the same as he was, but he conceals it with a civilized mask that makes him seem refined and enlightened. Furthermore, the refinement went too far. After transferring all of his powers to his instruments, man lost a big part of his humanity. The apes are dumb and violent, but at least they have powerful emotions and an ability to enjoy life. The future humans are smart and composed, but they act like emotionless robots and eat synthetic and tasteless food. Worse, most of them seem to have lost their awe of the wonders of the universe. The second part of the movie tells the story of the mission and the AI going out of control, and the latter seems more human than the crew members. When Hal gets terminated, his fear is heartbreaking.
Dave, my mind is going. I can feel it.
And the third part describes the journey of the lone astronaut, and here we go in a different direction from the book. While the end of the book clears everything up, here it all just gets more confusing. When the hero reaches the room in which he is to undergo the next stage of man's evolution, he once again performs the basic human activities, but suddenly there's something awkward about them. When he transforms, he is reborn as a baby, looking at the universe with uncomprehending eyes. As we saw in movies like Spellbound, the prevailing belief at the time was that human science and reason can decipher the secrets of the mind and of the universe. Clarke's book is still part of this mentality, but Kubrick's Odyssey leaves us with a feeling of awe, and that we have no way to fully understand our universe. This is not the only confusing thing about the movie. It has no narration, the dialogue is sparse, and there's seemingly no plot that connects the scenes together. The Hollywood establishment, mostly, didn't understand it at all, and thought that this was the end of Kubrick. They didn't realize that it actually signaled their own demise. For the young generation, A Space Odyssey was nothing short of divine revelation, and they flocked to the movie theaters to take part in the experience. John Lennon claimed that he watches it every week, and declared that there should be a shrine built for it, in which it would play repeatedly. The last part, with its groundbreaking visual effects, was seen as the ultimate psychedelic trip. What Kubrick wanted to create in this movie is a purely cinematic art piece, which will rely on the means that are unique to cinema. It is an art form that weaves together beautiful images, designs, motions, colors and sounds, and visual effects created by the newest technology. Of course, all of these elements were in cinema before him, but they were considered secondary to plot, drama and dialogue, while Kubrick puts them at least on the same level, turning the viewing into a sensual pleasure. Another novelty is his use of music. Rather than hiring someone to create an original soundtrack, he used existing pieces, editing the movie so that the sights match the sounds. And since these pieces have meaning in our culture, their use enables him to make a statement. Thus, he uses the opening of Richard Strauss's Thus Spake Zarathustra every time we witness a new stage in man's evolution, making it seem like a movie about the transcendence of the human spirit and its progress towards its final destination. But in the space portal scene we hear the eerie avant-garde music of Georgi Ligeti, music that has no linear order, which seems to symbolize the disintegration of the spirit and loss of direction, and the bewilderment that we feel at the end of the movie. In the movies that he made in this period, Kubrick attacks the idea that human nature is something different from the ape, and that human progress means freeing ourselves of our animalistic side, as if only our body comes from the ape, while our spirit is something else, which must free itself of the animalistic body that it is trapped in. Man, Kubrick tells us, is all ape, albeit an ape that has become more sophisticated and refined, and that's for two reasons. One, which we've discussed, is the instruments that he developed, which turned him into a creature that relies less on brute force and more on sensitivity. This is symbolized in the famous transformation scene, in which the ape, after learning to use the bone as an instrument, throws it upwards, and it keeps going up and up until it turns into a spaceship. Everyone understands that this scene shows how man's instruments have evolved over the years. But everyone, it seems, has missed the other thing that the bone turns into. After we watch the hairy and sinewy arm of the ape throwing the bone upward, the next arm that we see is the hairless and limp arm of the traveler in the spaceship, and above this arm, still floating in mid-air, is a pen. This is the other thing that the bone turned into, the other thing that humankind developed, writing, which enabled man to preserve knowledge and pass it on to the next generations. But in the process, Kubrick hints in his movies, man has come to elevate writing to a level where it is seen as more real than actual reality, more real than the actions that it describes. Identifying himself with the written word, man has come to regard himself as a purely spiritual being, and detached from the world of action, the world of the body. But since man is still an ape, all his energies come from the body, so denying it only diminishes his spirit. Furthermore, since we cannot transcend our ape nature, denying it only means that we are controlled by our animalistic drives, instead of learning to channel them in positive directions. In Kubrick's movies, all writers are murderers, killers of the human spirit. And it is this civilization, the civilization based on the written word, that his cinema is trying to liberate us from. When he adapts a book, he transforms it with cinematic means, to make action more powerful than words. This is true even for 2001, where he collaborated with the author on developing the story. The humans in the movie, just like in Clarke's novel, are all committed to the forward march of humanity, but if they bothered to look out of the window, they would have realized that the universe itself isn't moving forward, but actually going around in circles, dancing a waltz. The waltz, in the eyes of Western culture guardians, was considered an inferior style of music, because European high culture has turned dancing into a functional thing, something done for other purposes, such as courting, instead of for the sake of itself. But Kubrick shows us that the order that rules the universe is actually cyclical, so dance music might actually be the realest music of all. And the culture guardians are thus preventing us from living a real and happy life. But there's new hope for humanity. In interviews of this period, Kubrick said that he feels that the generation that grew up with the Beatles already perceives the world differently from previous generations, and is ready for the type of cinema that he had to offer. In rock and roll, the instincts are not repressed but directed towards dancing and ecstasy. Action is placed above writing, technology is there to service humanity, and there's no pretension to know the secrets of the universe. Kubrick presented cinema that had the same values, using all that the 60s had to offer, including the aesthetics of psychedelia. He liberated cinema from its dependence on other mediums, and showed what heights it can reach as a pure art form. The new generation of American directors learned and internalized. This new generation came mainly from the group that revolved around Roger Corman. They were learning the craft while helping him churn out his B-movies, but had aspirations to evolve and make bigger movies. Peter Fonda and Dennis Hopper wanted to make a movie that represents the counterculture. They decided that the only way to make an authentic movie would be to remain independent, with Fonda producing and Hopper directing, and both playing the leading roles. But they still needed someone to finance and distribute it, and no studio was willing to take that risk. Luckily, they were not the only people in the movie world that were imbued with the spirit of the counterculture. Again, it all begins with the Beatles. Bert Schneider and Bob Rafelson were a duo of young American movie makers who got turned on by Beatles movies, and wanted to create the American version. They took the concept of a band made of 4 members with different personalities, like the Beatles, and pitched the idea of making a TV show out of it. They decided which personalities the members will have, and then auditioned hundreds of youngsters to play the parts. In late 1966, the TV show The Monkees went on air, offering a combination of slapstick comedy, teen spirit and rock and roll. The 4 band members acted and sang and pretended to be a real band, but the songs were written by professional songwriters, and the music was performed by studio musicians. The result was sweet pop music that went well with the spirit of the Summer of Love.
Though you've played at love and lost, and sorrows turned your heart to frost, I will melt your heart again. Remember the feeling as a child when you woke up and morning smiled. It's time you felt like you did then. There's just no percentage in remembering the past. It's time you learn to live again at last. Come with me, leave yesterday behind, and take a giant step outside your mind.
It worked. The Monkees managed to create a hysteria that was reminiscent of Beatlemania, offering an alternative for the teeny boppers just as the Beatles withdrew from live performances. But at the same time, as we've seen, the rock world was going through a transformation, in which it started to take itself seriously and didn't want to be considered as fluffy pop music anymore. Since the Monkees were a so-called fake band, a band that didn't even play its own instruments, they were despised by this new consciousness. By the end of '67, even the band members themselves were embarrassed to be part of the project, not to mention Rafelson and Schneider, who had aspirations to make quality cinema. All parties decided that it was time to break up, but do it in style, through a movie that would combine the cinema of Fellini and Antonioni with the spirit of psychedelia, and create a salad of sounds, colors and illusions. The movie, with the script written by Jack Nicholson, came out in '68, and is called Head. So Schneider and Rafelson weren't proud of what they did with the Monkees, but there was one part of it that they could not complain about. The project made them rich, and now they could use the money to do what they really wanted. They set up a production company, aiming to advance young movie makers and allow them to make their art. When Hopper and Fonda pitched their idea of a movie about the counterculture, it was just what they were after, and they gave them the green light to start shooting and the free hand to do what they wanted. Hopper and Fonda commissioned Terry Southern, a brilliant satirist who wrote the script for Dr. Strangelove before he joined the counterculture, to write the story, which became a story about a couple of hippie bikers who go across the state on their way to the Mardi Gras in New Orleans, experiencing all sorts of adventures on the way. The movie Easy Rider came out in 1969, a pretty amateurish film that suffers from a lot of technical flaws, but makes up for it in other ways.
I pulled into Nazareth, was feeling about half-past dead. I just need some place where I can lay my head.
The movie was shot outdoors, against the backdrop of the American prairie, and contained all the ingredients of the counterculture: free love, psychedelic trips, living on the road, going back to nature, and rock and roll. The heroes are anti-establishment, but their life is pathetic rather than heroic, reflecting the sense of failure that permeated the counterculture that year. For the first time, this generation felt like it got a legit movie that was made from its perspective, and its technical flaws only made it feel more authentic than some flashy Hollywood flick. Another virtue was the music. At first, Hopper and Fonda tried to follow the Hollywood tradition, and hired Crosby, Stills and Nash to write an original soundtrack, but they didn't like the result, and decided to just raid the record shelf of late 60s rock music. The assorted soundtrack, and the way that the editing makes it work with the scenes, is one of the main reasons that the movie is still watchable today.
Take a load off Fanny. Take a load for free. Take a load off Fanny. And you put the load right on me.
Rafelson and Schneider went on to other successes. Rafelson, in particular, turned out to be a talented director, working with Jack Nicholson to put out a string of hits. The big Hollywood studios realized that they need to adjust to the changing times, and formed departments run by young people who had an understanding of the counterculture. The perception of the director as artist started to take hold, and directors gained more respect and power. Many young directors started to make original movies, looking up to Kubrick as their role model, and also displaying the influence of foreign directors. In the 70s, they will completely transform Hollywood and reconnect it with the spirit of the time. Two directors distinguished themselves from the bunch. Francis Ford Coppola and George Lucas represented a new breed of independent directors/producers who aspired for complete control over their own movies, while at the same time producing films by other directors that they believed in. Inspired by Kubrick and the French theoreticians, they fought against the big studios, and managed to establish themselves as independent directors who make enough money to finance their production company. While Kubrick was a lone wolf, Coppola and Lucas saw themselves as part of the counterculture, and used their power to push new directors to the front of the stage. By the early 70s, American cinema was dominated by new names, young directors making a new kind of cinema, using actors that didn't look like glamorous stars but like regular people. The movies no longer tried to educate the viewers, no longer always ended with good triumphing over evil. After the collapse of the 60s dreams, realism and pessimism were the prevailing mood. 70s movies were more realistic, took place in a dark and violent world where the lines between good and bad weren't clear, set their heroes against powers that they could not defeat, and often had a depressing resolution. Unlike the triumphant war movies of the 50s, the new war movies were affected by the dubious morality of the Vietnam War, and portrayed war not as heroic but as insane. Several movies brought Vietnam home, and portrayed their veteran heroes as carrying psychological scars and contributing to the rising violence in America. What typifies these new Hollywood movies is that they brought in the European approach, but combined it with the American way. The difference between European and American movies is like the difference between a symphony and a pop album. A European movie is a slowly building story, while an American movie is a succession of scenes, each trying to stand alone in its uniqueness. The new American directors brought these two together, trying to build up psychological drama, but at the same time creating jolting scenes. Thus, genres like gangster flicks, horror and science fiction, which were previously regarded as cheap Hollywood entertainment, now became templates for works of art. All of a sudden, Hollywood became the center of not just commercial cinema, but also artistic cinema. Directors from all over the world came to use its luxurious means to make their art. Even Michelangelo Antonioni, the man who helped open the gates, came to California. After he captured the spirit of the mid-60s with Blow Up, his next effort tried to do the same by making a movie about the late 60s counterculture. Zabriskie Point, which came out in 1970, mixed psychedelia, hippies, Marxists and other signs of the time, in the director's unique style. The music was provided by acid rock bands like the Grateful Dead and Pink Floyd. Another foreign director working in Hollywood at the time was Milos Forman. Born in Czechoslovakia, Forman lost his parents as a child, both executed by the Nazis. He became a filmmaker in the 60s and was a leading figure in the Czechoslovak New Wave. This movement was inspired by the spirit of the 60s, and often used dark humor and surrealist imagery to bypass censorship and show what the communist authorities wanted to keep hidden. It was part of the cultural awakening that was known as the Prague Spring. When Soviet tanks rolled into Prague in 1968 and crushed this awakening, Forman immigrated to the United States. His first Hollywood movie was a flop, but his earlier canon was impressive enough to get him the offer to direct an adaptation of Ken Kesey's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and this was right up his alley. With Jack Nicholson as a perfect choice for the leading role of McMurphy, and with a director who knew all about the evils of an oppressive system, Kesey's brilliant novel received an equally brilliant movie to go with it. Forman's next movie was yet another adaptation of a counterculture classic. James Rado and Jerome Rainey were two young actors who were part of the hippie subculture, and had an idea for a musical about their life. In late 1967, the musical Hair opened in a small off-Broadway theater, to modest success. This was enough to get Broadway producers to purchase it and offer it to the mainstream public, but not before they made it more accessible to a wider audience and added some more uplifting songs. The Broadway production also contained nudity, which, along with themes like free love, drug use, draft dodging, and many other elements of the counterculture, ensured that the play would live on in infamy. It became a big success, running for years, and today it is like a time capsule that preserves that moment in time.
Any person who alters, forges, knowingly destroys, knowingly mutilates, or in any manner changes this certificate may be fined not to exceed $10,000 or imprisoned for not more than 5 years, or both.
In 1979, Milos Forman finally adapted it to the big screen, but by then the hippies belonged to the realm of nostalgia, and the movie is more glamorization of their culture than a realistic depiction of it. For many, including Rado and Rainey, it did not feel true to the spirit of the play. That did not prevent it from being a hugely popular movie, and Forman would go on to make more successful movies, usually about other anti-establishment pop culture figures.
When the moon is in the seventh house and Jupiter aligns with Mars, then peace will guide the planets and love will steer the stars. This is the dawning of the age of Aquarius, age of Aquarius.
With the Hays Code gone, Hollywood could now deal with themes it dared not deal with before, and reflect the cultural changes of the 60s. One of the main themes was of course sex. Sex was now dealt with explicitly, either through surrealist explorations of repressed sexual fantasies, or through dramas that dramatized sexual relationships, or through comedies that made fun of the puritanical fear of it. Then, there were many movie makers who simply used this new freedom to make exploitative flicks that offered cheap sexual thrills. For a while, even porn gained legitimacy, and some porn movies became pop culture staples, before the borders between art and porn became clearer. And with rock music blasting the deepest cravings of the subconscious over the airwaves, everything was now out in the open, with the inevitable result being that surrealism lost all of its power. By the mid-70s, surrealism pretty much disappeared from the screens. Another inevitable outcome was a conservative backlash, which was also manifested in film. In 1968, the veteran director Don Siegel directed the movie Coogan's Bluff, in which Clint Eastwood, in the cowboy image he was then famous for, plays an Arizona detective who comes to New York to investigate a crime, and enters the world of the hippies, who are portrayed as a decadent and degenerate culture. With hindsight, this was the test run for the more famous character that Siegel and Eastwood created in 1971, after the confrontation between the counterculture and the authorities escalated into violence, and required someone even tougher than Coogan. Dirty Harry is a film about a San Francisco cop who is chasing a local psychopath, but to get him he must go through the counterculture and its hatred for cops, the media that is sympathetic towards the counterculture, and the authorities that have been so weakened by liberalism that they are afraid to do their job. This is how conservative America perceived the 60s, and it hints at the triumphant return of conservatism in the 80s. So, after the collapse of old Hollywood in the 60s, the counterculture saved it by creating cinema that combined foreign influences with the pop culture of the rock and roll generation. One of the aspects of this was that rock and roll records now became the soundtrack of movies, and one of the early examples is Yellow Submarine. The movie came out of the animated TV series called The Beatles, which started broadcasting in 1965 and featured the animated figures of the Fab Four, voiced by other people, in a musical sitcom based on their songs. When the music became more psychedelic, the creators of the show had the idea to make a feature film around it, and they wanted the animation to reflect a new direction. In short, they wanted it to look different from a Walt Disney movie. The weird animation makes the movie feel like a psychedelic trip, and it has the Beatles tripping through different fantasy worlds, based on their songs. The movie, which came out in 1968, is peppered with typical Beatles witticisms and 60s messages, and is still a colourful and enjoyable delight. Animation is of course a great medium for psychedelia. The early Walt Disney animated features, starting in the 1930s, sometimes displayed the influences of surrealism, albeit made suitable for children. Animation was not thought of as meant for adults, but, like everything else, it all changed in the 60s. And the origin of this revolution wasn't Hollywood, it was comic books. The comic book industry, like Hollywood, was operating under a code. Just before rock and roll became the great menace, it was comic books that were blamed for all the ills of American society, and in 1954 they were muzzled by the Comics Code Authority. For a decade, there was no outlet for those who wanted to make adult-oriented content in comics, but then came the counterculture. A bunch of cartoonists from Austin, who became known as the Texas Mafia, felt restrained in their hometown, and moved to San Francisco in the mid-60s to create the comics that they wanted to make. There they were greeted by fellow Texan Chet Helms, manager of Big Brother and the holding company, and the man who made another Texan, Janis Joplin, the lead singer of the band. Helms hired the Texas Mafia to create posters to promote the band's performances, and the psychedelic posters that they made did a lot to define the aesthetics of the era. The underground media started to feature psychedelic comic strips, gleefully traversing the code. One man who took notice was Robert Crumb. Crumb was a cartoonist working in Cleveland for a Square comic book company, but he wanted to do something else. When he tried LSD, the visions that came to him weren't rooted in fine art, like they were for Aldous Huxley, but were all distortions of images from American pop culture. He started to draw what he saw, but he had nowhere to publish these drawings. When he saw the comic books coming from San Francisco, he hitched a ride to the Golden City, and started to create comics based on his weird characters. In no time, Zap Comics became a massive hit in the underground. Kinky sex, drug-fueled visions, and manifestations of the darker sides of the human psyche were all part of the Zap menu, and of the other underground publications that followed. All that was left now was to make a movie out of them, and an animator named Ralph Bakshi got Crumb to reluctantly sell him the rights to one of his creations, Fritz the Cat. The movie, which came out in 1972, was promoted as the first X-rated animated feature, and uses humanized animals to represent typical characters of the counterculture. But it is a sensationalized version of the hippie culture, that has very little to do with the spirit of the 60s. According to Crumb, it also had very little to do with the character that he created, and he disowned it. But to be fair, In 1972, this depiction was pretty true to what the counterculture has evolved into. Bakshi would go on from there to make more X-rated animated movies.
If you look to your left, ladies and gentlemen, the view is not very inspiring. But if you look to your right...
The Beatles also made a non-animated psychedelic movie, Magical Mystery Tour, which came out as a TV movie in late 1967. The movie tries to combine the random and absurd humor of the early movies with psychedelic images, but doesn't quite get it right. But the formula for something better was there, waiting for someone to have a crack at it. Perhaps even someone from within the movie itself. Magical Mystery Tour features a performance by musician and comedian Neil Ince, who was trying to bring the spirit of Dada into 60s rock and roll. Ince went on from there to be a cast member on Do Not Adjust Your Set, a sketch comedy TV show that ran for 2 seasons. He then continued to pursue a musical career, but the rest of the cast added some more members, and launched a new TV show, called Monty Python's Flying Circus. Running from 1969 to 1974, the Flying Circus got it exactly right, making TV of a type never before seen. With their combination of absurd humor, iconoclastic attitude and surrealist imagery, Monty Python revolutionized TV comedy and later movie comedy, carrying the spirit of the Beatles into the 70s. The surrealism was provided mainly by Terry Gilliam, an animator who started out in underground comics and brought their aesthetics to television.
Oh, what a lovely little...
In America, there wasn't much countercultural stuff going on in way of television. The closest American TV came in the early 70s was The Partridge Family, a popular sitcom about a musical family that was driving around in a colorful bus. For a mix of humor and surrealist imagery, you had to go to underground comics, or underground magazines like National Lampoon. But in 1972, National Lampoon started to expand to other media, beginning with the theater play Lemmings, a parody on Woodstock, starring newcomer comedians like John Belushi and Chevy Chase. In 1975, finally, these comedians were recruited to make a TV show that will be the American answer to Monty Python, meaning the same subversive humor and anarchic spirit, but with a lot more rock and roll. Saturday Night Live went on air in 1975, bringing the music and humor of the counterculture straight into American living rooms. And, most importantly, it was done live, which connected it to the moment. All that was needed to make it perfect was a touch of surrealism, like Monty Python had. In the first season, the show did try to feature some surrealism, and had a corner preserved for the Sesame Street guys, who wanted to make adult material with their puppets. The corner offered some weird and surreal moments, but they did not gel well with the rest of the show, and after 1 season they left, to produce their own adult TV show. The Muppet Show was extremely popular, and it did contain some surreal imagery, but it was completely divorced from the real world. The merger that the surrealists and later the hippies tried to achieve, the merger between the dream world and the real world, no longer worked.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
The moment when Saturday Night Live hit the screens can actually be seen as the moment when the counterculture was fully absorbed by the mainstream, which essentially meant the death of the counterculture. With America out of Vietnam, and after President Nixon was forced to resign, there wasn't much left to it. The new president, Gerald Ford, wanted to heal the American society and bring it back together, and his administration stopped hounding counterculture figures. Saturday Night Live constantly made fun of President Ford, but did not treat him as an enemy. The revolution was dead. You can see these processes in cinema, too. As the decade progressed, the effects of surrealism and psychedelia faded away, and Hollywood movies became increasingly more realistic, not to mention dark. This went on until 1977, the year that punk killed hippie rock for good, which was also the year when everything changed in cinema, mainly due to one movie. George Lucas wanted to make a film that will be an allegory to the battle of independent directors against the Hollywood establishment, and the battle of the counterculture against the establishment overall, and he wanted to do it based only on building blocks taken from American pop culture, comic books, sci-fi, B-movies, etc. The result was a movie that appealed to the sensibilities of American moviegoers like no movie ever did before, and started the age when pop consciousness took over the art of cinema. With Star Wars, American pop culture asserted its dominance over European culture, and would dominate the movie world ever since. This is not the only reason why Star Wars was such an unprecedented phenomenon. After a decade of dark movies infested with anti-heroes and uncertainty, Lucas offered a story of good versus evil, of mythical heroes you could identify with. These heroes, like the hippies, held a belief that saw us as an integral part of the harmonious universe around us, and drew their power from it to fight against an evil empire that wants to destroy this harmony and rule everything, led by an emperor that was based on President Nixon. But by the time the movie came out, Nixon's presidency was a thing of the past, and the story of the counterculture started to recede into history. Star Wars begins the era when cinema would create its own mythologies, with no need to rely on the real world or on literary sources. A few months later, Steven Spielberg offered a science fiction fantasy of his own. Spielberg was already a star director, conquering the world 2 years earlier with the horror thriller Jaws. But Jaws was a movie that still reflected the dark spirit of the decade, and presented the establishment as caring more about profit than about protecting human lives. Close Encounters of the Third Kind already pervades a different spirit. The heroes still have an anti-establishment mentality, but in the end they find out that the establishment is not against them, but rather united with them in standing in awe before the wonders of the universe. While Jaws expressed fear of the alien, manifested as a great killer shark, Close Encounters suggests that we should open up to the alien, and see what it has to offer. In a way, Spielberg went back to the original adventurous spirit of psychedelia, with aliens that interact with us via colors and sounds, opening a new world before us, and culminating in an improvised jam session. But this also marked the death of the 60s spirit in cinema. Jaws was the beginning of the blockbuster era, and Star Wars solidified it. These movies showed how you could make a fortune out of cinema, and this was a reality that the Hollywood establishment quickly adjusted to. The big studios regained control, learned to speak in the language of the new cinema, and started to create movie franchises, around which they could create an entire industry of other merchandise. Many of the independent directors, meanwhile, sank into the self-destruction that typified the counterculture in the mid-70s, and could not compete. By the end of the decade, Hollywood was back, bigger than ever. In this Hollywood, surrealist imagery was relegated to the domain of fantasy and horror. Lucas and Spielberg, the Monty Python guys, and the Muppet Show guys all continued to make movies that offered a mix of surrealism, humor, adventure, action, and technology. They created fantastic worlds and images, but these worlds were no longer connected to the real world. They were fantasy gardens for 80s pop culture to play in. Perhaps the most illustrative movie is 1985's Labyrinth. Produced by George Lucas, scripted by Monty Python's Terry Jones, directed by Muppet Man Jim Henson, and starring rock icon David Bowie, it tells the story of a girl who hates the boring real world and dreams of living in fantasy world. But when she gets the chance to actually visit this world, she realizes that the world that doesn't obey the laws of logic is a pretty bad world, full of injustice, cruelty, deceit and ugliness lurking under the magical surface. In the end, she comes to the conclusion that she must live in the real world, and the fantasy world can only serve to enrich it at times. It was the aim of surrealism, and later psychedelia, to dive into the human mind, uncover its hidden content, and make it a constant part of our daily life. Movies were seen as the best medium to do so, and movie makers of the 60s had a mission: to create an immersive experience that would be more full, and therefore more real, than the reality that we usually experience. Films like Labyrinth reinstated a traditional hierarchy, in which the dream world is subordinate to the real world. 80s cinema and 80s mentality no longer understood what the 60s were about. Surrealism and psychedelia were left for dead.